Fresh drinking water is something that most Canadians don't think about on a regular basis. Most of us have had access to it our whole lives, and it's sort of just a resource that we take for granted at this point. I've personally been fortunate enough to have always had access to fresh drinking water, but sadly, not everyone in Canada is this fortunate. As of June 2021, there are 59 active boil water advisories on First Nation reserves throughout Canada. A boil water advisory means that any water you use for consumption has to be boiled before use due to the water being contaminated. Drinking contaminated water can lead to disease or even death, and these are the dangers many First Nations reserves have to deal with every single day. But Canada is a prosperous nation. Not only is it incredibly wealthy, but it possesses over 20% of the world's fresh water. So with this in mind, one can only wonder how Canada cannot provide this essential resource for its own citizens. In this film, I will be exploring just why and how this issue continues on. I first heard about this issue leading up to the 2015 election when it was a topic for debate and discussion amongst party leaders. Trudeau in particular raised awareness about the issue and vowed to end boil water advisories if he was elected. But here we are in Trudeau's second term, and as we know, this still continues. But to truly understand this issue, it is first important to look at the creation of the reserve system itself, as well as its long-term impacts. And the reserve system began in 1876 with the creation of the Indian Act. The act made sweeping changes within First Nations communities across the country and led to the creation of reserves. These reserves were created under the guise that they would be autonomous areas for First Nations people to live, places where they could live with less interference from the Canadian government. However, in most cases, these reserves were purposefully placed on undesirable and remote land, and the Canadian government continued to interfere in the affairs of these communities. In addition to this, First Nations people were restricted on how they gathered their resources, and hunting and other traditions were shunned by the government. These reserves often had their land polluted by government projects, which disrupted the lives of these communities and made living in these areas even more difficult. The Indian Act also led to the creation of band governments, which were essentially councils where First Nation people were able to make decisions about their community. These band governments continue to operate at First Nations reserves to this day. Currently in Canada, there are over 3,000 First Nation reserves and around 600 bands. So that is the basic way that these communities are governed. So what do these communities have to do if they want to get clean water? Well, it is a process that not only takes time, but often does not have conclusive results. In order to tackle this issue, water treatment facilities need to be built on First Nations reserves to be able to service the inhabitants. These reserves receive annual grants and funding from the Canadian government that goes directly to the councils and chiefs. So the councils and chiefs have direct control over the infrastructure built within their communities. But every First Nations reserve has its own unique issues and challenges, and sometimes spending has to go to other areas. But for some of these communities, the Canadian government has directly funded water treatment facilities instead of relying on the reserve to fund the project. The First Nations and Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, or for short INAC, is the section of the government that oversees these projects. The INAC and the Government of Canada created an outline that shows the 5 stages to building infrastructure on a reserve. The stages are as follows. The first stage's purpose is to identify the infrastructure needs on the reserve. The second stage is the creation of a loose blueprint, and once it's approved, it can receive funding from the Canadian government. In stage 3, the First Nation has to find a construction company that is willing to complete the project. However, finding suitable candidates can be difficult considering how remote some of these communities are. Also, finding a company willing to build the project within the parameters can be difficult. In stage 4, there is a tendering process to see which company will build the facility, and finally, stage 5 is the actual construction of the water treatment facility. The total process of planning and construction can take anywhere from 3 to 4 years to complete. There has also been issues with private construction companies cutting corners in order to finish the work quicker. Take the situation of the Niskandiga First Nation. They hired a construction company to build a water treatment facility, but the construction company's work was cheap and low quality. As a result, the water treatment facility quickly fell into disrepair, and this story is more common in reserves than you think. Also, constant maintenance is required on these facilities. Repairs and replacement of parts is necessary to keep these plants up and running, and many of these communities don't have individuals who are trained and taught how to maintain these facilities. Communities also need specific chemicals to maintain the facilities and often do not receive them, resulting in the water once again becoming contaminated. So not only does this process take a lot of time and a lot of steps, but once the construction is done, there's other problems that can still arise. So the process of planning, building, and maintaining these facilities is difficult and takes years of work. This is one of the biggest reasons why there are still boil water advisories in 2021, but fortunately things are beginning to change. Since 2015, 107 boil water advisories have been lifted, and new projects are currently being planned and constructed. So while the process has stagnated, the government at least is dedicated to ending this issue. The question is, though, is it enough? Every day that goes by where these people can't drink fresh water from the tap is a failure by Canada. First Nations people have been let down time and time again and had their issues pushed to the side with little regard for their well-being. So whether we choose to restructure the reserve system itself or accelerate the construction of the water treatment facilities, this problem needs to be solved once and for all.